Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Before we start off tonight's show, I would just love to say thank you ever so much to everybody that subscribed in the last week, everyone that commented and shared and liked the videos that I've put out. The support has been amazing. Thank you so much, guys. We are currently at 887 subscribers in the family, and I can't wait to see where we're sitting at on Monday. We are obviously going to celebrate 1,000 subscribers with a very special show, and I've also got 4 interviews lined up which I will be releasing, one each week following the 1,000 mark. So do stay tuned for that, guys. Going to have some very renowned researchers and experts, if you like, within the cryptid fields of Bigfoot, dogmen, UFOs, ghosts. And I think you guys are going to enjoy that. So without further ado, I have found some stories for tonight's show that I just feel are really good, really interesting, scary, chilling accounts of strange times in people's lives. I hope you guys enjoy this. Please do let me know below in the comments. Without further ado, guys, let's get into tonight's first story. I grew up in the city with my dad. We lived in Toronto, and I loved it. It could be a scary place at times, but I figure in every big city, if you watch the news enough, then you become scared of what lurks in the streets outside your windows. The city was great as a kid, ignorant of the danger you see every day. There were parks, recreation centres, ice rinks, wading pools, all within walking distance of our rundown triplex. We lived on the main floor. The neighbours upstairs were young, a couple perhaps in their early 20s. The people who lived below us I never saw. They had a back door that led outside and up a set of concrete stairs into the backyard. They never used the front door, and our backyard was open into an alleyway. So I suppose they never bothered going out the front because they could reach the streets from there. I was used to living with my dad for my whole life. My mum had only been around for those few early years of my life when I was too young to remember. She was a junkie anyways. Rather shoot up than go home to her kid. That doesn't matter anymore. I've learned not really to give a shit about family. I know you're supposed to love your family, but as I got older, I realised I was more bitter and terrified towards them than anything else. My dad seemed great when I was little, but he became cruel after years of failed relationships and pointless one-night stands. Maybe he was just bitter towards women. Maybe he just began to hate my face. By the age of 17, I had become accustomed to my role in the house. Cook the meals, tidy the house, avoid my father while he was drunk, unless I wanted to become his punching bag. Simple. Sometimes he was sober, but he was even more mad then. There wasn't really a safe place except for staying out of his way. That helped. Then, one day, my role changed. I was standing in the backyard, wandering towards the alleyway, while my dad slept off his most recent bout of poisons. That's when I first saw the boy. He was good looking, my age, or maybe a year or two older. He was dressed really well. I was surprised someone that age would walk the streets that way. He wore a deep red button-down shirt and black dress pants. He was coming towards me from the side of the alleyway that led deeper into Regent Park. It made me curious about him. No one from that neighbourhood was anywhere near refined. Regent is the ghetto. It's where I was born. My mother was probably standing on the corner somewhere down there. As he approached, he held out his hand. "Nice to meet you. I'm Adam." I was kind of stunned. In all my life, I had never met someone who looked like him. Dark hair, dark eyes, beautiful face. Not at all the type of person who you'd expect to see socialising with a girl who likely looked like she was half-starved. Welfare doesn't pay well enough to support food, rent and rampant drinking problems. I was instantly embarrassed at our obvious class difference, but held my hand out politely. Hello, I'm Catalina. I felt my face redden as I introduced myself, and he kept hold of my hand. Are you sure about that? He smiled. I stumbled for a moment. What? He gave me a small laugh. You don't sound positive about your name. Do you prefer something else? Cat, maybe? I visibly winced at the pet name my father used when he was actually feeling remorseful over his behaviour. Lena, then? That's pretty, though it was a lovely name to begin with. He shot me another dazzling smile, but I could tell that he was mulling something over in his head. That's good. Why are you here? I was still blushing at this point, but my confusion over his presence was coming to the forefront. He seemed a bit surprised at my sudden question, and I began to apologise before I could help myself. I'm sorry, No, I understand. Why you'd be confused about me being here. I came to find you. He smiled again, but I was suddenly incredibly wary. A handsome stranger had come looking for me. Around here, that usually only meant bad things, even if he was only a teenager, maybe especially because he was. I have to go. I began backing away, trying to pull my hand from his, but before I could take half a step back, I felt a large hand grab my shoulder from behind. What the fuck are you doing? Are you stupid? My father screamed at me, his grip on my shoulder bringing fresh pain to old bruises. I saw Adam's eyes narrow as he and my father stared at each other. Let go of her. Adam's voice had taken on a dark tone, and he gave my father a look of pure hatred. I found myself terrified of both of them, yet tightening my grip on my acquaintance's hand. I let out a cry of pain as my father yanked me back and I fell to the ground. Adam reached towards me, only for my father to push him away aggressively. He turned to look at me on the ground. You whoring around now too? Get up. I began trying to get to my feet, but once my knees were under me, I was met with a hand around my throat. I said, get the fuck up. He was lifting me by my neck when suddenly the pressure was gone, and I fell back to my knees, breathless. I stared in awe. Quickly than what could be humanly possible, Adam had lunged and pinned my father to the ground. There was blood, but somehow I managed not to scream as I watched Adam use his teeth to rip out my father's throat. He came to me with blood dripping off his chin, and when he put his hand out to help me up, I took it. I didn't say a word as he aided me in standing. I just stared as the blood flowed onto his shirt and disappeared into the fabric. Then I started laughing, and if he didn't look concerned before, he sure as hell did now. I couldn't control it, and for some reason I felt the need to explain. I'm sorry, I think it's a nervous thing, I sputtered out through fits of laughter. He still looked fairly concerned, but smiled and began to lead me away. I'm not sure why, but I didn't feel like he was going to hurt me. He led me back into my home, sat me on the couch, and left for a few minutes. All I could think of while sitting there was that I felt relieved. My entire life had just changed. I no longer had a father who would hurt me and hold me here. I could leave, but I didn't. I found myself far too curious about this boy. Where did he come from? Why did he come to find me? Why did he attack my dad? And why the hell did he use his teeth? Adam walked back in, and I was running over the questions in my head, and it took me a second to register what was different about him. He had cleaned off all the blood. Out of all the questions I had right then, I blurted out possibly the stupidest one. Did you intentionally wear that colour? He laughed. Maybe I did. I wasn't sure what to follow up with. I had no idea what was going to happen next. I wasn't afraid, but I didn't entirely trust this complete stranger yet. However, I did trust him enough to follow him when he asked if I would like to leave. I had nowhere else to go. Besides that, I was absolutely bursting with curiosity. There was too much mystery about this boy. He walked down the alley with me until we reached a dark car. He held the door for me, something I'd never had anyone do for me. In fact, at that point in my life, I had never actually been in a car. I'd been on city buses, streetcars, and subways, but no one had ever driven me anywhere in their own vehicle. I sat in an almost awe-stricken state while he drove across the city. I felt comfortable at this point, enough that I was now thinking more heavily about what he had done less than an hour before. A bit of panic arose in me. He could easily kill me as well. It was rational fear. This boy was a murderer. I had to ask the one thing that nagged at me. "What did you do with the body?" "Oh, it's in the trunk, mostly." He didn't skip a beat or look my way as he spoke. How was I supposed to react to that? My father's dead body was in the car with us. Didn't that make me an accomplice? That wasn't the most pressing question. His words brought though. "What do you mean, mostly?" "Well, I was a bit hungry." That answer, and what it admitted, should have scared me off. This boy had eaten some part of my father. I should have been terrified, but I was still bursting with curiosity. I could have left then. I could have jumped from the car that was being driven by this cannibalistic murderer, but I didn't. This was just the beginning of so much more. These events happened years ago in the past. Part 2 will be up very soon. Being a guy who makes nature documentaries, I spend most of my time seeing what goes on when people aren't around. Just like people, animals do some fascinating things when they think no one is around. I have seen some amazing sights. The sun rising and setting over a mountain horizon, a herd of elephants in the African grassland, watching a snake shed its skin. You get the picture. But, as you might expect, I have also seen plenty of things one doesn't exactly want to experience. Nature is a simple place, one where both majestic beauty and primal instinct coexist side by side. But the worst thing I have ever seen was at the Ridgemont Swamp. Ridgemont seemed like a pretty cool place, located just off Virginia, North Carolina's border. It's your typical cozy town, filled with charming shops and friendly, hospitable people who seem to know the comings and goings of everyone. The swamp is about 25 miles outside of town, and not many people venture there unless it's to go fishing or something. I always make it my place to do background on the area I happen to be, pick the brains of the locals and whatnot. It is always fascinating to see what they have to say. There is nothing like sitting with a cup of coffee and a homemade donut while talking to someone who has lived there in a place like that their entire life and can tell you literally all there is to know about the place, who is who doesn't get along with who and why, and most importantly, what lies beneath the surface. We were doing a series about wetlands and their cultural and historical significance in Ridgemont. Everyone kept telling me that there was a game the locals would play when they were younger. Apparently, it was a thing in the neighbourhood, a local tradition type deal. Every year, on October the 11th, a group of local teenagers would drive out to the swamp. Once there, they would take a tiny boat to the dock and watch while the youngest member of the group rowed out, rowed out into the water. Once the boat and its passenger were out in the middle of the swamp, the rest would leave so they could go keep track of time. The remaining kid would be left to stay there alone in the dark until he got too scared to stay. Apparently, the 11th was not only the day that Ridgemont was founded. It was also usually the date of the big football game against the neighbouring McFarland. Apparently, the tradition had been going on since the 1940s. Usually, the kid in the boat would last out there for a few minutes until some shadow or movement from the embankment would startle them sufficiently enough to frantically row back to shore. Charlie Swanson, a guy in his mid-40s whose family had lived here for 3 generations, told me the story over breakfast when I arrived in town. As he currently serves as one of the city's certified accountants, a member of the local PTA, and a member of the Ridgemont Chamber of Commerce, I knew right away Charlie was the kind of person I needed to meet. Finding his number in the country travel section, I set up the meeting, and he was more than happy to meet with me. He recommended a cafe right off Main Street. It was one of the best breakfast meals I have ever had in a very long time. A nice fresh broccoli cheddar omelette with potato hash browns. Real potatoes, I might add. Wow, I can manage fine with frozen hash browns. I refuse to touch instant mashed potatoes. Believe me, eating in as many diners and restaurants as I do, you learn the difference real fast. "Thank you for meeting me, Charlie," I said as I greeted him. "My pleasure, Carl," he replied, offering a firm handshake in return. We sat down and our food came pretty quick. He filled me in on the town and the swamp while we waited. I don't know where exactly the tradition started, but does anyone ever truly know how and where things like these start? Good point. Figuring out how these stories get started is virtually impossible. All I know is that by the time I got to high school, I had heard of the game. Usual teenage rite of passage type thing. Never did it myself, but a lot of people I know did. They always tried to brush it off, but you could tell it freaked them out. Some people like to tell the rest of us that something lived in the swamp, but no one ever saw it. What did they say it was? A slight smile appeared on his face. Depends on who you ask. Everyone had a version, a different story based on the friend of a friend. Someone said it was a Bigfoot, another claimed it was a cross between a monkey and a lizard. A guy on the football team said it was something that took the form of a massive white dog at night to lure unsuspecting people into the swamp, and once in its grasp it would rip you limb from limb. My old football pal Jack Arnold said someone told him it was the ghost of a woman who went into the swamp one day and never came out. All creative, aren't they? They certainly were. After finishing breakfast, Charlie and I parted ways. It was time to check out the reason I was there. Swamps are a fascinating place, especially for someone like me. All the things that inhabit it, just being near it lets you hear all of that goes on within. Dragonflies and mosquitoes buzzing around, frogs croaking in the middle of the night, or the sudden splash of an alligator as it catches a fish. Something about it is just riveting. It feels like you are in another world entirely. This one was no different. The thick moss strung out on tree branches like tinsel, the worn old wooden dock, the thick layer of bright green algae on the water surface, and the thick, damp smell that met you every step of the way. Time to do the hardest part of my job. Scoping out the Ridgemont swamp and setting up shop. I always make sure to take extra care when putting the audio and camera equipment in place. Like anything else, the key is location, location, location. Believe me, making sure you get the best location in a swamp is a bit challenging. Can't go too high or too low. The stuff is lightweight and waterproof, but you still need the best angle possible. But as always, I managed. Making good use of a rental boat, I sailed along, picking out the prime spots to catch some excellent footage. After setting up the cameras and everything, I headed out. I honestly don't know what I would do without the technology we have today. When I got back to the hotel, I immediately took a shower. Working all that time in the swamp made me feel pretty dirty. The humidity always seems to stick with you long after you leave. After I changed, I got myself a bottle of water. I sat down on my bed with my laptop on it to watch the live feeds. The sun was just beginning to set over the horizon, and the sunset was just beyond the treetops. You could see birds nesting in the trees and the water glistening off the surface. It was breathtaking. Since the cameras were not only live streaming but recording, I could take my time watching each feed. There were 8 of them. But what was most helpful was that each feed was equipped with a motion sensor. When the motion sensor was tripped, the feed would automatically send my laptop a notification, and the camera in question would immediately pop up in a window on my computer. It was all a pretty cool setup. Grabbing a bag of chips, I immediately made myself comfortable on the bed. Some of the feeds picked up a routine sort of stuff, a couple of frogs splashing around, a piece of driftwood here or there, and a bird landing on a tree near the camera. Feeling satisfied so far, I was just about to order myself a pizza when I received another notification. I heard the usual notification noise and went to check it. When I did, I immediately forgot all about pizza, or virtually anything else for that matter. The sun had set by now, and it was pitch dark in the swamp. The cameras are outfitted with night vision, so it isn't a problem. In fact, usually the best footage is gotten at night. How ironic. Camera 3 was located at the heart of the swamp. It was positioned on a high tree branch and could overlook almost anything in the area. It was now 8:37 p.m. There, right on my laptop screen, was the image of someone or something in the middle of the swamp. At first, it looked like a homeless man, long, stringy black hair, rags for clothes, and a starved-looking body. But why would a homeless man be in the middle of the swamp when it was pitch black out? I couldn't make out any colours apart from the hair. As I studied the feed more, I noticed something else. Its hands weren't really hands, they looked more like claws. The nails looked at least 6 inches long and were jagged looking. My hands were sweating ridiculously as I watched the feed. The laptop keyboard grew damp as I gripped it, determined not to miss a moment. He, whatever you want to call it, looked up briefly, and I got a clear look at the face. It looked skeletal, completely white looking, with no muscle or flesh to make it look like a human face. You could see the contours of the head quite easily. The teeth were all jagged and broken. It looked more like shards of broken glass had been stuck inside the mouth as opposed to any teeth. But by far the worst part was its eyes. They were solid black, without the slightest trace of colour or light visible. There was also no discernible iris or pupil. It was as if the entire eye was coloured black. At this point, I realised that there was not a sound in the entire swamp besides the faint splashing noise as the shape walked in the water. But that all changed as my audio feed caught the sound coming from the swamp. Laughing. It sounded just like a woman's laughter. Now, I don't mean it sounded like some old woman who you might mistake for a witch cackling away or whatever. Change the setting and you would mistake this for any normal woman's voice. The sound was somehow oddly alluring and terrifying at the same time. I even checked to make sure some pop-up didn't open on my screen or something. Sure enough, that thing was the sound, without a doubt. It was the single most horrifying thing I have ever heard in my life. For some strange reason, I felt that I should look to the top left of the camera feed at that moment. When I did, I had to look closer because I wasn't sure what it was. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree or something, or perhaps an old broken boat. I felt my heart sink into my stomach as I realised what it was. A large sheet of canvas or tarp was floating in the water near the entity. It looked like it was just floating there. When I got a closer look, I saw what it really was. It had been rolled up like a rug, but something was inside it, something quite tall, approximately 6 feet in length, something that was causing it to bulge out in odd places, meaning it wasn't quite flat or even. I felt my stomach lurch as I saw that whatever that thing was in the swamp, it was dragging the bulging canvas as it glided along the water. The moonlight caught the bundle, and with the night vision I was able to see that the wrapping was stained in places. Dark stains. It didn't seem possible, but the thing was somehow still moving along in virtual silence. All you could hear was some faint splashing in the water. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, the thing was gone. I was barely able to see it sprint away. The only sound you could make out was a single splash in the water, like something had been dropped in it. No other motion detectors were tripped, and the swamp now sounded like a typical swamp at night again. All the typical noises I had heard before seemed to immediately come back tenfold, like a volume button had been switched back on. I couldn't believe what I just saw. It seemed all that I was able to do was sit there silently. After what seemed like an eternity, I managed to get up and call the police to tell them what I saw. Believe me, it wouldn't be the first time a camera our company worked with picked up something a bit surprising, to say the least. They sounded shocked at what I saw, but I told them I would come in and show them the footage. About an hour later, I was at the police station, showing them the footage. They all stood around in shock. They immediately agreed to look into it, sending out a search party to check out the swamp. I left and I went back to the hotel in an attempt to get some sleep. Somehow, I managed to fall asleep sometime around 3 a.m. About 4 hours later, I packed up my bags, ate some breakfast, and got the hell out of Richmond as fast as I could. That place gave me the creeps, and I wasn't about to spend another moment there. I called my boss to let him know what happened, and he was actually pretty understanding. Not to mention, he thought we had an amazing opportunity with the footage that I got. Needless to say, when I drove out of town, I didn't drive past the swamp. The other way to get to the highway took an extra 20 miles, but I didn't care. There was no way I was going to go by that place again, not even to get my equipment. The stuff was easy enough to replace, but even if it wasn't, it wouldn't have made a difference to me. But the worst part was what happened after I got home. My boss called me and told me he did some research of his own. Using some old contacts, he was able to tell me that there were about 30 cold cases where a person went missing relatively close to Ridgemont. A couple of them were Ridgemont High students, scattered over the decades. The majority, however, were travellers who had been reported missing within 15 miles of the area. Hey, we're usually on the way somewhere else, but never made it. I have no idea what the local cops are doing about whatever it was that I saw, but believe me, I am never stepping foot anywhere near there again. The day was cold. I searched through the woods behind my log cabin, looking for old trees that had fallen. The wood from them would burn the best, giving me the most light during the dark night that was approaching fast. I felt an eerie feeling, and I always had felt eerie in the woods, like something was always watching me. I would hear things from time to time. The sounds were strange, but I would convince myself it was just the animals. I would hear sticks break and leaves crumble from behind me as I walked through the woods. Something must be following me. I assumed it was just an animal and shrugged it off as I always have. However, this time was different. As I approached the end of the woods, and with my log cabin in sight, I heard the sound of something running towards me from behind. I could hear the loud steps as they grazed the ground beneath them, galloping towards me. Within seconds, and before I even began to turn my head to look, I could hear the sounds as if they were right behind me. With mere panic, and as quickly as I could, I snapped around in complete fear as the sound was right in my ear, and to my complete dismay, the woods went silent. The sound was gone. I looked everywhere, in all directions, baffled by what had just happened, but yet I saw nothing. I felt so scared that I instantly ran into my log cabin and shut the door behind me. I quickly made a fire as the night approached and tried to figure out what had just happened, while I remained in a panic. Eventually, I was able to calm myself down enough to where I could go to sleep, but that was just the beginning. Scratches. I could hear them coming from the walls of my cabin as I awoke in the middle of the night. My guess was it was just an animal that smelled the meal I had just cooked before I laid to rest. The sounds became louder, though, and more profound. My heart started to race as I contemplated what it could possibly be. As my heart rate kept increasing, the scratches stopped. Silence is all I heard. I sat there, still as a rock, listening for any sound coming from the outside. Then, bang! My wall was struck with something massive. I jumped in my seat and stared at the wall as I started to tremble. The banging noise repeated as some creature or thing outside was pounding on my wall, trying to get in. My log cabin had no windows and only one door, which I always kept locked with a wooden board laid across it. The sounds suddenly stopped, and after a few minutes of silence, I took a sigh of relief. Maybe it decided to retreat back to where it came from after it realised it couldn't get in. I decided to close my eyes and go back to sleep as I could sense dawn was approaching near. I awoke. My routine was normal as usual. I made breakfast along with some coffee. While sitting on my front porch, I kept thinking about what had happened yesterday. I decided to walk around the log cabin to the wall where I heard the noises coming from. To my disbelief, there was nothing there, not one scratch. I asked myself, how was this possible? How could this thing have made such a noise without damaging the wood? I decided to further investigate. I walked around my property searching for tracks, and after 2 hours had passed and I found nothing. It's as if it was all in my imagination. I gazed at the sky and I could sense a snowstorm approaching. I decided to gather more wood as quickly as I could, and then I went back into the dark woods, but this time it was different. I knew I wasn't alone. As I walked through woods, I remained on full alert. My body was actually shaking from fear. I had that feeling again that something was watching me. However, I looked around me and saw nothing. I kept trying to focus on the task at hand, which was finding more firewood before the storm hit. I could feel the air getting colder as the sky darkened from the heavy clouds. I gathered as much wood as I could hold and started to head back for my cabin. As I approached the end of the woods, the hair stood up on my arm and I froze in place. Something was right behind me. I could sense it. It was coming closer, but I couldn't move my body even though I wanted to run. The leaves crumbled one by one as it approached from behind, the sticks breaking under its weight. The sound stopped as it was right behind me. Warm air began to hit my neck from its heavy breathing. I tried to move again, but my body was still frozen. My eyesight became smaller and smaller, and it became harder to breathe. I started to struggle for air as I could still feel the warm breath against the back of my neck. My eyesight went black, and the paralysis that consumed me let go as I fell on the floor of the cold woods, unconscious. Before I begin, I must warn the reader that this story contains extreme violence and gore. If you are underage to read such content or do not wish to read such content, I would advise you click out now. I stood over the peasants and observed them throwing up dirt from the hole. Such a simple thing. Exhumation. Yet it spent the hours like an extravagant aristocrat spent the pennies. It really was a dull affair. I could have been doing something more productive, but I trusted these lowlives with the job like I would a rabid dog with a child. My thoughts were interrupted by the thud of metal on wood. Finally, I crouched down and looked into the hole as one of the men began to brush away the dirt. They had reached the coffin at last. They opened it up and dragged the body out. Throwing it up out of the hole, I shuddered and took a step back. The two men took the deceased's belongings, as was part of our agreement, and they loaded him into a wagon, throwing a blanket over it. I got onto the wagon with them, and we began the journey away from the cemetery and back to my practice. When we reached our destination, after a grueling and laborious journey of near 20 minutes I could have spent doing something productive, the two peasants brought the deceased in and laid him on the slab. "I shall be requiring your services again tomorrow night. I expect to see you outside the graveyard at, shall we say, midnight, and not a minute later," I said as they turned. I got a grunt in reply, and they took their leave. I didn't expect anything more from their kind. The peasantry suffered from an absolute lack of manners and gratitude. They belonged in the dirt. I took my surgical tools and began examining the deceased by the light of a lamp. The peasants had stripped his fine coat and top hat and practically everything else, so I had little to do in the way of preparation. As I looked at the body, I noticed some very strange markings. The subject had died perhaps 72 hours before burial. Offer another 48 hours for my employees to dig him up. He had died from blood loss, and that was no wonder. There were strange marks across his leg. They went deep. They had severed the femoral artery. The subject had died within minutes. In addition, there were more marks in the shoulders and throat. The jugular, too, had been opened. The deceased had lost a lot of blood very quickly. Blood loss was most certainly the cause of death. But what were those marks from? They were like claw marks, and around the throat and leg, marks that looked strangely like teeth, rows of very small and very sharp teeth. I was making assumptions, of course. There was no creature with such claws and teeth. Then it struck me. I left the body and went to my bedroom, where I fought my way through a pile of old newspapers until I reached the ones I was looking for. I brought them back down to the laboratory. There had been 3 similar cases in the past few days. People with similar injuries, drained of all blood, and 3 days after burial their graves were found defiled and the corpses missing, of course. This would have been put down to grave robbers, but then nature of death and time between burial and exhumation were consistent with all 3 murders. I looked back down to the corpses on my table. This corpse had been buried for 2 days when we dug it up, and I had plans to dig up another corpse tomorrow night. I swallowed, and I looked at the strange marks on the body, claw and teeth marks. I wasn't keeping this body in my practice. I dragged the corpse off the slab and brought it outside. I looked up and down the street to make sure nobody was around, and I dumped the corpse in an alleyway, then rushed back to my practice. I went and got the gun from my bedroom and slept with it under my pillow. I like to believe that I was beyond superstition and the foolish ramblings of old women, but it was better to be safe than sorry. And I always had an overreactive imagination. I'd never been able to sleep without some sort of security. And that night I did not dream pleasant dreams. I writhed and screamed, trying to claw myself from the nightmares, but they gripped me tight and dragged me back to resume their torment. And when I woke in the morning, mercifully, I couldn't recall the horrors I witnessed in my sleep. All I saw was a hand in the dirt and something dragging itself up from a hole. The next night, I found myself rushing around to get my things at 11:30. I was always complaining about people being late, and yet here I was. I'd be late for my meeting with those 2 ruffians at the cemetery. I was in a rush, just grabbing my travelling clothes and rushing out the door, hoping I didn't forget anything important. I had spent the whole day reading newspapers and trying to recall the wounds on the corpse, regretting my decision to dispose of it. I rushed out to the cemetery, hoping I wouldn't be too late and that those 2 commoners would still be lurking, out of greed if nothing else. I always got them a corpse of an aristocrat. They were always healthy and well dressed, a win for both myself and my 2 less charming employees. But as I reached the graveyard, dread slowly began to creep up on me. I could just feel it. Something was wrong. The iron gate to those old burial grounds was open. So I just walked through. Among the headstones, I saw no sign of my companions. I ascended to the top of the hill on which the cemetery lay. I saw no one around. It was unusually cold that night. It was a terribly cold summer's night. I breathed white clouds as the icy air bit at my flesh, and that odd feeling of dread grew and grew within me, a poison slowly infecting my heart. "Hello?" I called. I heard a rustling, but that was it. I looked over my shoulder, then took another step forward up the hill. "Is anybody there?" I called again, but my voice was frail and nervous. I heard a sound, slurping and licking. I couldn't place it. Then a sort of faint sucking. I swallowed, realised my hands were trembling, my teeth chattering, and for a moment I was paralysed, standing like a statue amidst the dead. I broke my paralysis and took a frightened step forward. The sounds were my imagination. I always did have an overreactive one. Many a dark night did I lie awake, my mind concocting all sorts of foul beasts that could potentially be skulking in the shadows. The consequences of an overactive imagination. But when I reached the top of the hill, I wasn't so sure anymore. Was it my overactive imagination? Or was there really a man lying in the dirt? I knelt down over him, recoiling at the stench of blood. I took my handkerchief out of my pocket and held it to my nose, squinting to examine the body. My overreactive imagination seemed to have lost its edge, because this body was very, very real, and very, very lacking in blood. The trousers had been ripped, and the soil was wet. The throat had been mangled and torn by rows of tiny, sharp teeth. But there was very little blood in the soil. This man was one of the peasants I hired. So, where was the other one? I stood up and looked around. A chill ran down my spine. I should have run. I should have turned and run back to my practice and forgot the night, but something compelled me to go on. I walked further into the cemetery, descended deeper into the abyss, and I saw the second man lying over a headstone, disemboweled. Blood had poured down the headstone, but something licked it off. I felt bile rise in the back of my throat. Dear God, what kind of a creature had done this? What kind of a monster had committed this vile act? And then I heard a slurping noise, and I slowly turned. A clawed hand was reaching out of the grave I had stood over only the previous night. The grave these men had dug up. The grave the man I had examined came from. The grave where he had been buried 3 days ago. Another claw hand rose from the grave and buried itself in the dirt. And whatever was there, whatever monstrosity that had clawed its way out of the depths of hell to terrorize this mortal plane, was rising. In my revulsion and horror, I barely caught the thing's appearance, but I do remember one thing. I remember the slavering monster's mouth, the jaws of hell open, blood and saliva dripping out, the tiny, sharp teeth a dark crimson, and the creature uttered 3 foul words. "Where is it?" And with that, I ran from the hill, wailing like a banshee, off into the night, in whatever direction my legs would carry me. And I kept running until darkness engulfed me and consciousness failed me. And to this day, I find myself locked up in my practice, the revolver never far from my grip. My sanity had failed me, my security had been stolen, and the prospect of suicide often wandered into my thoughts. The key to my chains, the only release from this torture, and every night I sit thinking about what crawled from that grave, and wondering when it will come to replace what was taken from it. Wondering when it will come, the thing in the cemetery. Wow. I hope you guys enjoyed that collection of stories I found on Reddit. I really did truly enjoy reading those. Please do let me know in the comments below, guys. Please do like and share. And as ever, folks, remember, be safe, not sorry.